To introduce tonight's amazing speaker, David Amaya. He's one of our fantastic speakers, and I'm glad to have him back again. So tonight he'll be speaking on Scrum and my ADHD brain. So David, whenever you are ready.
Okay, thank you, Colin. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me, and yeah, thanks for all those kind words. I really appreciate it. So yes, I'm David Amaya. I'm a full stack developer for nearly 20 years. I'm very passionate about mental health, and often if you're on the Code and Supply Slack, you'll find me in that channel, in the mental health channel, as well as other channels, careers, work, life, and everything else. And so I'm gonna start sharing my presentation. And so, as Colin mentioned, this talk is called Scrum and my ADHD brain, or my ADHD brain on Scrum. And to start, this is my brain. In the back there, that you might see a frying pan, and that's Scrum. This is my brain on Scrum. Any questions? Anyway, does anybody, I guess some people probably remember those PSAs from the 80s. I really enjoyed them. I like them a lot. And yeah, if I was a sharper person, I probably would have a series of egg puns, try to get a few yolks. But anyway, this talk is Scrum and my ADHD brain. So in it, we're going to talk about my brain. We're going to talk about Scrum and my ADHD brain, and then a conclusion and kind of bring it all together and see how we can find things that we can apply in our work and in our life. So first, my brain. I have ADHD. I was diagnosed actually in June, just 3 months ago, a little over 3 months ago. And it happened with the pandemic, coronavirus. And so it's, we were all there. It's still going on. But although like the office where I worked was shut down when there was a lockdown order in Ohio, I'm based in Ohio, they opened up the office May 11th, and I wasn't really comfortable with it. I didn't really feel safe at that moment. And even still, I tried to go into the office for a week, but those days that I went in, I could not function. Throughout the time I was there, like I could drive into the office. I was able to drive to the office. I was able to get to my seat and sit down. But once I was there, I could not do any work. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm a software engineer by trade. And in my mind, it's like, I could do this work remotely. I was doing just fine remotely. Why do I have to be in the office? And I found, I'm sure anybody who's been in that situation has felt that way. And I found that I could not let it go. Eventually, I found out that that was emotional dysregulation, which is not really a part of the DSM-5 diagnosis for ADHD, but research has shown, and the experts do agree, that emotional dysregulation is a part of it. And emotional dysregulation is a failure to regulate normal emotions. So it's different from a mood disorder, where I'm not a medical professional, but like with mood disorders, it's like you have outsized emotions. Your emotions are kind of like off the charts. But with emotional dysregulation, you feel in the normal way, but you don't really have that ability to regulate as normal people do, or neurotypical people do. So it led to a lot of frustration. And it was interesting because it's an issue with performance. So it's not having the knowledge. I knew what I needed to do. I had the skills to do it, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it. And that was a factor. And after a week of that, and not being able to let go of those feelings, I ended up trying to seek professional help, tried to find a psychologist or a psychiatrist. And in the end, over the course of, feels like a month, I was hoping it would get done in a week, but it took about a month. That's when I got the diagnosis, when all that happened. And so another aspect of ADHD, and for me in particular, is a deficit in working memory. So working memory is the memory that you use in order to work. But more specifically, it's kind of like RAM to some extent, where you're using it, you hold it in memory, and then you kind of you can work with it, you could tweak it. So it's while you're working, understanding like, what was the goal? Like, what's the goal that I'm working towards? What are the steps towards the goal? What step was I on? And an interesting thing with ADHD is that when normal people get distracted or something happens and there's a stimulus, they're able to remember. The working memory is what allows them to re-engage with the task that they're working on. With ADHD, and in my case, if I get distracted, I forget, what was I working on? Where was it? Like, what step was I on? I lose track of those things, and then I have to reacclimate myself to it. And then if you think back to the other issue about that I was having, where I wasn't really happy to be there, I was regularly distracted by these thoughts that I like, why am I here? What am I doing here? Like, and I was frustrated by even my mere presence in the office. It frustrated me, and it made it very difficult to work. So you pair that with the working memory deficit, then it's like every time I'm almost about to work and get something done, my brain goes off onto that track about not wanting to be there and not wanting to be in that situation. And, you know, what if somebody gets sick? Anyway, but that's that was the challenge that I was having at that time. So another side of ADHD and my ADHD brain is time blindness. And that time blindness there's many aspects to it, many facets to it. But one is a nearsightedness to the future. So I wear glasses. I mean, I'm not wearing them right now, and I'm not wearing contacts either. But the reason I'm doing that, or the reason why I'm not wearing glasses, is because I can see this distance. I can navigate at home based on my vision. Like I can see clearly to the tips of my fingers and beyond a little bit further. And with my ADHD brain, it's kind of similar with time. I can see clearly, you know, within 24 hours, a little bit more fuzzy as we get to a week, a little bit fuzzier when we get to 2 weeks. But as you get further and further out, there's more haziness, especially when it comes to action and taking actionable steps. And another side of that time blindness or nearsightedness to the future is that it's hard to see the future over time. So it's difficult to organize complex behaviors across time. And that's actually part of your executive function, your frontal lobe. So like from what I've learned so far, like the back of your brain stores information, or it's mostly used for storing information, but the front of your brain, your prefrontal cortex, or your frontal lobe, that handles more of the organization and like organizing behaviors, organizing activities, and handling those things. And with ADHD, it's a little less developed. It's a little less developed over time. So it's difficult to organize that behavior across time. So when it comes to complex actions, it's very hard to develop those steps. Like I can see the goal, like, you know, vision, dream, whatever. I can know where I want to go, and I can kind of identify where I am, but it's hard to see how to take the actions over time to reach that goal. And so that's another challenge that comes with ADHD. Another aspect is a self-motivation deficit. So I mentioned before emotional dysregulation. Well, our emotions, or researchers have found that and one in particular, Russell Barkley, had a nice talk about a presentation about like 30 things parents should know about ADHD. But one thing that he mentioned was that our emotions are our motivations. So if we can't manage our emotions, which is emotional dysregulation, then we can't really manage our motivations. So, and we need motivation, the ability to self-motivate in order to take care of any goal-directed activity. Any goal-directed activity requires us to be able to motivate ourselves, because there's going to come a point where you're not going to want to do the next step, the thing you have to do. And personally, that's something I found, it was interesting too. After I got the diagnosis, it made sense. Like, oh, okay, that explains a lot. Because there was many times in my life, in my career, where it's like, I couldn't get myself to do the thing that I needed to do. And there were times, like it would happen with work over time. And sometimes over time, I kind of learned to develop little things to help me along, you know, where it's like, I don't know how I'm going to feel tomorrow, so I can't necessarily guarantee that this will be done in 24 hours. So maybe I'll give myself a little bit more time so that I know if I have a good day or if I have a bad day, I'll have enough time to get this done. And so I found little tricks and things to help me to manage and get along. But I didn't know at that time that, oh, no, it's my ADHD brain. It's ADHD. That's what's going on. So it's a difficulty. It causes that difficulty to self-motivate. And the flip side of self-motivation, like if I have difficulty self-motivating, that means I'm more dependent on my environment to get motivation and or be successful. And so that's actually quite a big thing. Like if the context is so important, your environment, my space is very important to how I can be either motivated or just be successful because I have these tasks in mind. So I found that I need to construct an environment where I can thrive. And so as I was thinking about this, so after I got my diagnosis, I did think back like, so, this has been going on for a while. This ADHD is not new for me. I mean, like the diagnosis is new, but this is what I've been working with for a very long time. So when was I most successful? Like when did I feel like the most productive? And how can I, create that environment? And how can I do better and work with that? And what I found or remembered was Scrum. When I worked in Scrum, I am actually a certified professional Scrum Master with Scrum.org. Forgot to mention that. But so I've worked with Scrum. I've learned about Scrum. I've used it. And Scrum is an agile methodology that allows you to work in a way over time, like continuous improvement over time. So I wrote a little description that it provides transparency and accountability with the aim of continuous improvement. And it has different methods and events to do that. And some of you might be thinking like, I work with Scrum. It's a little rough sometimes. The point of transparency and accountability, it's supposed to be with the aim of continuous improvement, like of the team and also performance. But your mileage may vary depending on the team that you're on, and how those kind of thing, how that goes for you. Because in theory, you have actually, I'll switch to the next slide. In theory, you have your development team. The roles are product master, scrum master, product owner, scrum master, development team. But the development team is really supposed to be united. Like the goals, like your sprint, you're supposed to do it as a team. If you succeed and with your sprint, if you complete it as a team. If you fall short as a team. And so team dynamics can play a factor, because if instead you have people kind of like isolating team members and just like, okay, you failed the sprint or you caused us to fail, it really can turn toxic. So Scrum isn't like an end all be all. Like it doesn't necessarily, if you have problems or team dynamic issues, Scrum won't fix it. But it has a lot of good things about it that if you do it well, it can be beneficial. And so we're not going to have we're not going to go take a deep dive into Scrum. We're just going to kind of focus on the things, the practices and events that affect the development team and how those can help, at least how they help my ADHD brain. Because there's many other conversations that can be had, including about product management and the product owner role and how they differ, and then how Scrum doesn't care as much about product management or the product owner as it does other things, or at least, but that can be a topic for another day, talk for another presentation. So Scrum has these 5 time-boxed events. They have the sprint, which kind of covers everything, or actually we're going to get into each one, but there's a sprint, the planning meeting, the daily Scrum, sprint review, and the sprint retrospective. And we're going to get into each one now and get a little bit into kind of how it helped my ADHD brain in different ways. So first, the sprint. And the sprint is this time box container for everything that happens within Scrum. It's your the greater period of activity. And the focus is on development activities. So at the end of the sprint, you're supposed to have what they call an increment, which is like a functional piece of software that's ready to deploy. If the feature's not complete, then it's not really, it shouldn't be a part of that increment. So that's kind of what happens with the sprint. And usually it's time boxed, typically 2 weeks, although it could be longer and it could be shorter. But I find that the sprint helps with kind of those issues of time blindness, that nearsightedness to the future. Like I mentioned before, my personal, like my physical vision, my eyesight, I'm nearsighted, but I can see clearly, tips of my fingers. And similarly, with time blindness, I can see clearly, roughly about 2 weeks. 2 weeks is probably as good as my vision is going to get when it comes to like the future, when it comes to executing. Because the thing with ADHD is that it's not a problem with knowledge. It's a problem with performance. There's a deficit when it comes to performance, when the rubber hits the road, and it makes it challenging. And so personally, I can't really think more than 2 weeks out. And I'm going to probably get to it too, but I have like this notebook or bullet journal that I'm working through that I have really only kind of planned 1 month out, or 1 week out, I should say, 1 week. And then I have calendars and other things to kind of help me manage time beyond then. And we're going to cover that too as well. So one thing I do like about that sprint is that it does have a nice time box to it within a frame of time that I can really wrap my head around as a developer. Also, there are Scrum tools. There's tools in Scrum that are very beneficial. One is a topic, or a category, I should say, is information radiators. And so just like heat or radiators, or a heater radiates heat, information radiators radiate information. So one of them in particular that I prefer, or that I really appreciate, is a Scrum board. And a note I also wrote is that these information radiators must be visible to radiate information. And so one example I really like is a Scrum board, because it makes work visible. And this is not my Scrum board. I kind of picked it up off the internet, but it was good enough to utilize. And so there's a column that says undefined, but you have a column for your backlog, and then you have a column for the things that you commit to in the sprint. And then you have another column where you might have your in-progress items, or you might have multiple columns that show the things. You have multiple columns to show the different stages that your work item might go through. So you might have a column for code review, or for Q&A, and for testing, and for other things. And to see the work item that you're working on physically and see where it is in the process lets you know at a glance where your task is, and then how it fits into where it's going. And that was something I really, really appreciated. And then another tool that comes to mind are digital tools, where you have like your Trello, or your Azure boards and Azure DevOps, or Asana, and or Kanban boards in general. But they usually have these task items that you can add comments to. And that really helped out with my working memory as well. And I kind of find I would have some fun with it and entertain myself a little bit. But if you looked at my cards or my work items in a Trello, or an Azure board, or anything else like that, you would find that the comments are basically a running commentary of what I'm thinking at any given moment on this task. So what I really appreciated about that was I externalized my working memory. So if I ever got distracted, I can look at this card and go through all my thoughts and get caught up and know exactly where I am and where I need to go next. And as long as I did that and kept up with it, I can get distracted. I can go have lunch. I can play ping pong. I can do whatever I want, and still come back and not spend a whole bunch of time ramping up and getting back up to speed. I just kind of read all my notes, and it's like, okay, that's where I was thinking. That's where I was at. This is where I'm going. Okay. And I can continue. So there are many tools with Scrum that allowed me to better manage my work, to offset my working memory or deficit, working memory deficit and time blindness. So I really appreciated that. Another item is the sprint planning meeting or another event. And the sprint planning meeting, it has, in that step, you inspect the product backlog, and I would lump in backlog grooming. You probably wouldn't do backlog grooming during the sprint planning meeting, but I figure we'll throw it in there too. But at this time, it's important for estimating your work items, because Scrum, Kanban, most agile methodologies that break things into work items, they work best when those work items are small and when you can accomplish them relatively quickly and keep it simple. So discrete, small, and with little to no dependencies, so that you're not waiting on this to happen or waiting for that to happen. It's like, oh, we need to talk to get the DBA to do this, or we need to get, so limiting dependencies make it really helpful and easy to work through. And during this the sprint planning meeting, that's when the development team goes through the product backlog and they say, okay, we can commit to this much. And they, as a team, decide to commit to a sprint and the work items that will be included into the sprint. And I found that this helps with accountability or organizing those complex behaviors. As I mentioned before, when it comes to working memory, trying to hold the future in your mind and then work with it and to develop the steps that you need to take in order to make something happen, that can be relatively difficult. And so with things like your backlog grooming, you're actually working with your team to take these projects and take these items and break it apart and break it into digestible pieces that you can start executing on. Instead of trying to figure it out while you're working on it, you already have it in a small enough piece that you can start going through it. And I found that is also good for motivation. Hopefully you're on a team that the whole team is included in sprint planning, because that's where some things can go sideways, where one or two people in the team commit the team to this, but like if you're on the team and you didn't have input, then how motivated will you be to follow through on this commitment that somebody else made in your behalf? So that's where things can go a little sideways. But if you do sprint planning well, have a whole team involved and get involved in agile estimation and all those other things, it can really help out in a lot of ways when it comes to that motivation, when it comes to accountability, and when it comes to organizing like complex behaviors or breaking those things down into the pieces that you need to take. So daily Scrum. With the daily Scrum, what is it? Daily Scrum is a 15-minute daily meeting. And I want to stress 15 minutes. In theory, it's supposed to be a stand-up. And the reason you stand up is because nobody would want to stand up for that long. And so, or for more than 15 minutes. But with the daily Scrum, you assess your progress towards your goal. You sync your activities. So if you're working on something that you might need to work with somebody else on, you can kind of line up how you can do that. But you also create a plan for the next 24 hours. And that, of course, also helps with that time blindness. So being able to organize and see what you can do and when and how that plan can line up. And also, it works out for when it also with accountability and motivation. And so every day you're accountable. It's interesting, like Dr. Barkley, or Russell Barkley, talked about how the problem when it comes with when we have ADHD or a person with ADHD, the issue isn't accountability. We don't have a problem with that. The issue is kind of like the performance and the execution. And so a good way to help isn't by removing accountability, but adding more accountability, kind of sprinkling accountability and consequences throughout. And I found that the daily Scrum is often very motivating. So if you find yourself spinning your wheels here and there, sometimes like that hour, 2 hours before the daily Scrum is like, oh no, this meeting's about to, we're about to have this Scrum. I really need to have something to say. And hopefully that should motivate you to get things done. Because I know, at least for me, it's like that. Sometimes that procrastination can get difficult, and sometimes that motivation to push forward is hard. So having that deadline makes it easier to perform, and it's a source of motivation. And then the other side too, small wins over time improves morale. So it's nice. And if you break your items small enough, you won't find yourself spinning your wheels as much, which is also a benefit and can increase joy, can spark joy. And so we move on to the sprint review. And with the sprint review, that's when you review your product increment. So the work that you did is shared with the stakeholders. You go through it with them. They inspect it. They give feedback. And it's nice. It's crossing the finish line. And then you only show the completed features. But it's a nice time to get feedback from the stakeholders and share what you've done, which is always a pleasure. I find too, if I'm not going to share what I'm working on with anybody, if nobody's going to see it, what's the point of doing it? And that kills my motivation as well. And then we have the sprint retrospective. And I really appreciate retrospectives. Taking time to sit back, discuss the processes, how things went, behaviors, what did people do, tools, and the goal is to find actionable improvements. So hopefully, like, the issue isn't that somebody's not pulling their weight, but like, if that was an issue that was to come up, the goal would be to identify what impediments were there. Was it that the work item wasn't well defined enough? Was it that the individual lacked skill? And if they did, what can be done? Maybe pair programming is more necessary. Maybe there's something else, some training, some things that could be done to improve things. But the goal should be to improve the team and improve the performance of the team, but not at the sacrifice of the team members. And it's something that's sad sometimes, because I even when I was looking at Scrum boards, there were a number of Scrum boards that had like swim lanes for each developer. And like, that, to me, that doesn't make any sense, because you're trying to work as a team, and splitting it up that way, it's like, oh, well, that person only did 2 work items, but that guy did 6. And so it can cause issues. But the nice thing too is, with the retrospective, the team members are accountable to each other. It's nice. That's something that I appreciate, just that accountability to each other. And so outsiders shouldn't really be pushing in, although many times in practice, stakeholders or others outside of the team and outside of the greater Scrum team start really pushing and trying to control or directly influence the team, where that's really not their place, and at least in Scrum. But retrospectives should be a positive time for everybody to keep building, improving, and working towards improvement. And yeah, so constructive feedback and getting that feedback loop tightened up. And the nice thing too is that, as we mentioned before, about when it comes to not being able to really visualize the future in an actionable way, sprint retrospectives allow you to have continuous improvement over time. So even if you don't have a roadmap, you know that if you did better this week than you did last week, and you keep doing that so that this week is better than last week, you will get better. Things will improve. And so that's one thing I love about retrospectives, is that the more you do it, hopefully the less backsliding you do, but you will keep making that forward progress. And so I really love that about sprint retrospectives. So brief review is Scrum, my ADHD brain. I'm going to share these slides later, so I guess don't try to read them, because we're not going to get through them. So it comes up to the question, or the point. In conclusion, it's important to create an environment where you can thrive. Whether you use Scrum, whether you don't. I find that to be the case with myself with ADHD. My environment plays a huge role. So if you're looking at this and wondering, like, what can I do? It's important to create an environment where you can thrive. And with ADHD, as we mentioned before, it's not an issue of knowledge. It's a deficit in performance. So if you want to make a change, you need to make the change at the point of performance. You need to make the change at the place where you're not using what you know. And so it's so important to change your environment or create that environment or make those kind of changes. So when it comes to the working memory deficit, what change can we make? Well, if we have a deficit in working memory, it's important to find a substitute for that working memory. And that substitute should be outside of our brain and in view. So like a Scrum board. As I mentioned before, like when I was in that office, the Scrum board was there and we could see it. You just turn around, it was there, you saw it. He was like, what was I working on? I'm like, oh, okay, that's what it was. And that's one of the challenges with the digital one. For instance, I use Azure DevOps, and it's important to have, I guess, a second monitor. And on that monitor, you have your board, so you know exactly what you're working on, so you can see where your tasks are, your work items are, and move it along. And that's so important to have it visible, because if you don't, it's going to be gone. It's out of sight, out of mind. And so that's what I'm working through right now with my journal. I've been trying to make a bullet journal, or working through a bullet journal. And I found that I had this nice little schedule, like, okay, this is my plan for the week. But then either my journal was closed, even if I had it around, and I didn't do anything with it. But now I'm learning, it's like, oh, okay, I need to, once in the morning, I need to open up my journal and have it open on my desk, so it's right there in my field of view. And I can make whatever notes I need to make. I can look at whatever I need to. So for working memory deficit, externalize it. Find a substitute and make sure it's outside your brain and in view. When it comes to things like time blindness, if a task involves time, we need to use something to keep track of time. So that might be a timer. It might be a planner, like a day, week, month planner. Might be a calendar, might be a notebook, and so on and so forth. And like I mentioned, in my case, I use my bullet journal for kind of the day-to-day items, because I've tried day planners. They don't work for me. They don't work for me at all. But like a bullet journal like this, it works really well, where I keep track of things by the week. I started creating a week schedule in my notebook every week, writing down all the things that I want to try to accomplish that week, and then having a schedule for each day of what I want to do that day. And it's really helpful for me. I probably should have put a link to the bullet journal in the resources, but I forgot. When it comes to the challenge of not being able to see the future over time, being able to see those actionable steps, it's important to break the future into pieces. So break projects into baby steps that you can do a piece a day. And then you can also incentivize doing those baby steps. And like I mentioned before, I like that with sprint planning allows you to do that, backlog grooming. And it's interesting too, because I had the idea for this talk about 3 months ago, a little after I got my diagnosis. And it's like, yes, I really want to do this. This is a talk I really want to give. And something I could have done, probably should have done, was break it into tiny pieces. So, do maybe 1 or 2 slides a day, or watch a video to do some more research on it. But something each day to move the ball forward. Otherwise, you find yourself later scrambling at the last 24 hours or 48 hours to get it done. And yeah, even like a month ago, I mentioned to Colin, like, hey, I want to give this talk. And we scheduled it a month ago, and still, if you don't break it into pieces, that time blindness or nearsightedness with regards to time doesn't hit you, so you don't start working on it until it's right there. It's like, oh, wow, I really need to get this talk done because I'm giving the presentation tomorrow. And so that's important. Break the future into pieces, and then baby steps that you can take day by day. Second, the flip side of that too, and making that change at the point of performance, when it comes to consequences and accountability, it's really important to tighten the feedback loop. So oftentimes, like, we think of things like we have an event and then the outcome is so far away. So like even with the talk, it's like the event, it's scheduled about at the beginning of the month and for the end of the month. And I need to find ways to tighten that feedback loop between the action, the event, or my response, and then the outcome. And so even when it comes to feedback and retrospectives, it's so useful, because how good is feedback if you have to wait 6 months to your annual review to find out what you need to improve. It's so important to get that feedback daily. And so, or as soon as possible. Daily is probably best, or soon after the action comes. Which is another reason why I like ping pong. I found that I really enjoyed ping pong because I can get instant feedback. If the person I'm playing against puts too much spin on the ball, if it touches my paddle and goes sideways, like, okay, I need to adjust. So every single time I could adjust a little bit more until I can get it back onto the table. So it's tightening the feedback loop. And video games and other things do that the same way. So yeah, being able to sprinkle consequences and accountability throughout really helps when it comes to things like time blindness and not being able to see the future over time and organize our actions accordingly. When it comes to self-motivation, a change that we can make at that point of performance is to make all motivation external. So put something in it for you, but not far in the future. You know, like if you start January, like, yeah, I'm going to start working out so that by summer, I'm going to look good in a swimsuit. That's too far in the future. That doesn't really work, or at least it doesn't work for me. But I have ADHD. And that's the whole point of this whole talk. So put something in it for you, but don't put it too far out into the future. Like use points, use tokens, whatever you need to. And so, for instance, for myself, I have it in my journal. I created my own little point system for staying active. So I have a goal where I'm using points. I give myself points for steps a day. So if I can stay active, like get 250 steps each hour between like 7 and 5, then I get X amount of points. And then if I get 10,000 steps, I get another amount of points. And if I can do 10,000 steps consecutively over the course of a work week, I get Z amount of points. And by actually doing that, I was able to consecutively, or to get 10,000 steps throughout the work week consecutively for about 10 weeks now. I think I'm running on 10 weeks. I think this might be my 11th week. And so it's been really working out. And eventually I need to start implementing it in other ways, like strength training or something, like give myself $10 if I can do, $1 per push-up or something like that. But anyway, but the point is that if you put something in it for you, it will help you with that motivation, because like I mentioned, we have to make that motivation external because it's hard to motivate ourselves internally. It's like, it's funny, I should be walking for my health, but that's not a big enough motivation. So I've created this reward system in order to get myself to stay active. So here's some resources that I found. A lot of these points you'll find in that the 30 essential ideas you should know about ADHD by Dr. Russell A. Barkley. And there's a whole playlist on YouTube for it. All these links are from YouTube. How to ADHD is a channel that I really appreciated. And the first video I saw from them was, do you have a wall of awful? And that actually hit me pretty hard. I never thought that I had ADHD, and that video and a few other videos on the channel actually started making me think that route. It's like, because I was wondering, like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I function? And this isn't the first time this has happened to me. But seeing that video, actually, yeah, it was really good. It made me appreciate things. So I also put the link to the channel as well. And there's plenty of resources that are available. And yeah, I hope you're able to enjoy this talk. And yeah, I want to say thank you. Thanks again for having me. And you can find me on Twitter, Amaya Human, amayahuman.com. And I don't have my LinkedIn up there, but if you search for me, and you'll probably find me. Or if you go through my website, there's a link to it. So thanks again for listening, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool, great. Thank you very much, David, for presenting once again. It was absolutely fantastic. We do have a couple of questions. First is from Jeremy. How do you handle frequent chains of interruptions?
Try to close the door. Try to escape. But depending on the tool, I think for me, what I found useful was having that, like Azure DevOps or Trello. In my card, I make a ton of comments, and I keep track of my train of thought. So everything I'm thinking, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm working on, I write everything down. I probably do more documenting for my own sake than I do working. I shouldn't have said it that way. I'm sure there's a better way to say it, but I do a lot of documenting so I can kind of get myself caught up quickly. Another thing that works, or that I've heard works, is using like the Pomodoro technique, where you have 25 minutes and 25 minutes for work, 5 minutes to not work. And then you make it clear that while the Pomodoro is going, while that timer is going, no interruptions. And hopefully you'll have a team that respects that, but definitely communication to try to limit those interruptions.
Next question, also from Jeremy. What do you do when the new thing pops up and overrides the current motivation for what you're originally working on?
Oh, I do probably what you do. I chase it, which is it's hard. But another thing I do sometimes I write it down because I find, and I'm learning. I'm a student of life. So I haven't perfected anything, but I have found that my life does this weird thing where I'm just kind of going in circles and kind of improving little things. So one day I want to work on the bass guitar, and I might be heavy into that for a few months, and then I put it down. It's like, okay, I want to do video now, and then I'm heavy into video for a few months, and then I put it down, and then it's like, okay, I want to do this, but I find myself circling back to the same 5 things. So I'm kind of building them up incrementally, which I hope is a good thing. But yeah, so writing it down, and sometimes a little bit of a chase isn't too bad, but trying to reel it in. Otherwise, you get frustrated too. There's a lot of frustration.
Great. And looks like we have one last question from Benjamin. How do you recommend dealing with people talking in different places, such as Slack, Teams, email, etc.?
Turning off notifications, first of all. Where were the other places? Were they all digital, or were they in physical locations too? I kind of missed it.
I think the intention is largely related to notification overload. Slack and Teams having an office chat system that is dragging your attention, as well as maybe you're on the Code and Supply Slack and some other social groups, as well as maybe Discord, and then you've got Facebook Messenger going on, maybe with family or loved ones, or some other thing going on, plus good old-fashioned text messages.
Yeah, as far as you can, turn off notifications. At least that won't get you fired. But and so yeah, so with my phone, sometimes I put on Do Not Disturb, especially when my family starts getting chatty. And yeah, put those devices away. Set time aside that you might check it, but then also set aside time. Like, these are my blocks to do my best work. Like for me, my best time to do my best work is probably like in the morning before 11. Usually I have a nice solid hours where nobody bothers me, and that's what tends to work well for me. But yeah, definitely turning off notifications. But if you see me on Code and Supply, I'm not the best at it, and because I actually really enjoy Code and Supply. That's really that's a highlight of my work week. Sometimes it's just I spend a lot of time there, so might not be the best person to take advice from on that front. Might not. I'm just saying, but turning off notifications, it works out well.
I noticed that I myself am really subject to doom scrolling, and I had to install an extension for Facebook that only loads like 5 stories at a time, and I only allow myself to like do 1 load, and that's just good enough.
Yeah, I stay away from a lot of things. Like I don't really look at Twitter too much. Like I follow a couple of artists, like cartoonists, like the Awkward Yeti. I really enjoy it. And so, but after I get a notification from him, so I only get notifications from like only a couple of channels. And so once I get a notification from him, I end up getting sucked into Twitter, and I find myself like, wait a second, what am I doing? And then I'm finally able to hopefully pull away at that point. But it's dangerous to get sucked in. So the best way is to not get anywhere near it.
We've got time for one more question, and we'll take this one from Sasha in chat. Do you have any advice for people without a team?
For people without a team, a lot of those practices, like even a Kanban board would be nice, and I tried it once, but the maintenance, the challenge is the maintenance. And so I found that having like my bullet journal, it works out really well. Granted, am I doing it the right way? I don't know. But I found it to be really helpful where I'm writing down my notes every like yeah, you can Google bullet journal and or look it up on YouTube as well. But it's a very useful practice. I'm not 100% on it. For instance, you're supposed to have a table of contents, and I have a table of contents up to page 70, but right now I'm almost on page 170. So there's 100 pages where I'm not really looking back, but over time I'll get better with it. But I find like bullet journals to be really helpful because I can kind of plan out I can make it my planner. I can make it whatever I want it to be. And I find that to be helpful as well.
Cool. Great. Thank you very much for joining us tonight, David. Thank you for your excellent presentation. Everybody else, thank you very much for showing up. And we're happy that you were able to attend this Code and Supply presentation. One last thing one last pitch that I want to do. Forgot a word there. I do want to highlight our merchandise on codeandsupply.co/store. We had something like almost 100 orders in the last 2 months, and we'd love to keep up the momentum of people buying some cool Code and Supply swag. If you want to suggest something, please bring it up in the Code and Supply Slack. I'm always looking for new ideas of cool swag that we can come up with and put on our print on demand store. Thus concludes tonight's presentation.